Okay, well, I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's workshop about advancing equity through your giving with Dr. Una Osili. I'm Emily Kornhauser, the Director of Collaborative Philanthropy at Rose Community Foundation. A repeat of a little housekeeping before we get started. We hope that today's webinar is really interactive. And as such, we encourage you to keep your video on, but please do mute yourself when you are not actively speaking. If you have questions during the presentation, and we hope you do, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to address them throughout the presentation, but we've also carved out time after the presentation to do a designated Q&A. At the end of our time together, we'll break into small groups for additional peer conversation and learning. But before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to Lindy Eichenbaum Lent, Rose Community Foundation's President and CEO.
Thank you, Emily. We really appreciate each of you joining us today, and it is certainly always fun to see familiar faces. Want to send huge thanks to Dr. Osili for being our guest speaker. I know we are all looking forward to learning from her. We hope today's session helps to connect you with fellow fund holders and donors and learn takeaways to infuse equity into your own giving. In philanthropy, we view the last 16 months not only as a time of epic crisis, but also as a time of epic opportunity. A global pandemic highlighting life-threatening disparities, a racial reckoning with long-standing systemic injustices, and the rise of anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-Asian sentiment have shown us how much work is done in creating equitable and just systems. But at the same time, our community responded to these converging crises with determination, rallying to support those most impacted and those furthest from opportunity. We appreciate how you, our donors and fund holders, have given to nonprofits on the front lines of COVID-19 relief and recovery efforts, to racial justice work, all while also accelerating your support for organizations with whom you've had long-standing commitments. Philanthropy truly has tremendous power to advance change and to engage racially, culturally, and socioeconomically diverse groups of stakeholders in facilitating that change. For Rose Community Foundation, enhancing the quality of life of the greater Denver community also involves explicitly recognizing that historic and systemic barriers exist based on race, resources, and gender. We have been intentional about the roles we can play in creating a more equitable region, challenging our own norms and practices, and identifying actions we can take individually and collectively to disrupt bias. And we are committed to inviting donors who are interested to join us on this journey of learning and action. At the end of today's program, we will share information about additional Rose Community Foundation resources and opportunities to infuse equity into your own giving. But first, I will hand it back to Emily to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Lindy. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Una Osili, who is the Associate Dean at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, the world's first school dedicated to the study of philanthropy. She leads the research and publication of the Giving USA Annual Report on American Philanthropy and is the founder of Generosity for Life, a digital platform providing data tools for philanthropic financial decision-making. She chairs the Philanthropy Panel Study, the most comprehensive study of the generosity of American families over time. And she is the global expert on philanthropy and social innovation, and we are thrilled to welcome her here today. So Dr. Osili, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all the colleagues at the Rose Community Foundation and all the donors who have joined us today. I am thrilled to be here. I only wish that I could be there in person, especially now that I have seen all the wonderful work that's taking place at the Rose Community Foundation and in Denver, in the Denver region. So welcome, everyone. And we've designed the workshop today to be truly interactive. It is not going to be a lecture, but rather a discussion. And so I am pleased and delighted to get started, but invite you to share your comments, your questions throughout the short presentation. To share my screen. And just before we dive into today's presentation, I'd like to just share, like many of you, I wear many hats. I am a researcher foremost, but also a donor, a board member, a trustee of a family foundation. And the events of 2020 and 2021 remind all of us that we are living in unprecedented times and that we cannot just go back to business as usual. The post-pandemic world is going to be informed by so much of what has happened over the last 16 months. And one moment in particular last summer that has stayed with me was during the protests, the racial justice protests of the summer, when I, out of just concern and not sure what to do next, reached out to my parents. They are both in their 70s, but they had participated in the marches of the 1960s. And what they shared with me was a lot of optimism about the future. They noticed that the protests had people of all different backgrounds, race, ethnicity, age, and they thought, you know, this is a moment that all of us should actually pay attention to, because people of all different backgrounds have come together to raise their voices. It was also a moment where we saw philanthropy step up, and this was through people's advocacy, their use of their voices, their time, their talent, and treasure. So while there is a lot of work to do in all of our communities, there's also a tremendous opportunity, and I'm so glad Lindy mentioned that, to embrace the voices that have spoken and demanded change, and to think about how all of us as individuals, as donors, as board members, as concerned citizens, as parents, as family members, can infuse issues of equity into our day-to-day life. So that is my personal commitment. And then let's get started with the research. So I'll start by sharing my screen and also emphasize that throughout the last 12 to 16 months, our team has been collecting data on how philanthropy is responding to the movements of our time. We've gathered data from national surveys, from platforms, from administrative records, but also we've conducted focus groups with donors of all different backgrounds, including 60 donors of color all over the country that we have worked with throughout the pandemic to better understand how their giving is responding to the challenges of our time. So everything that I will share is a reflection of what we have been working on at the school throughout this period. So a quick outline before we get started. To ground our discussion, I'm going to, first of all, introduce some definitions just to bring clarity to our discussion, but also emphasize the tools that we're using to measure philanthropy in response to the racial and social justice movement. I will share some of the progress that's been made, but some of the shifts that we're seeing in the landscape in both 2020 and continuing in 2021, the implications of all this work, and we will end with a call to action for all of us. We all have a part to play in this work, and that will be at the close of the presentation. So let's start with some definitions. One of the most challenging aspects of this work is actually to put some definitions on the table. If you are familiar with academics, even at the school, one of the projects we've been working on, there's a lot of debate about how you measure equity. My own background is in economics. I have a PhD in economics, so I'm definitely data driven. And when we think about equity, what we're usually referring to is the access to resources, and whether there are barriers, whether those are based on race, gender, ethnicity, religious identity, or any other factors. For those of you who are empirical and data-driven, you might say, when we look at the data, do we see that race or gender or ethnicity can explain a lot of what's going on rather than other characteristics? Equity recognizes that there isn't a level playing field and that some individuals, some households have access to resources while others do not. And not everyone has the same starting place. In other words, when we recognize that some individuals face barriers to opportunity and access, we can start to dismantle them. Today's presentation will focus on racial equity, but it's also worth mentioning that over the course of the pandemic and in going into 2021, we've also seen the intersection of race, of gender, of ethnicity, and also religious identity play a role with, as you've already heard, a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, hate crimes that have been focused on individuals from religious minority backgrounds, and many other areas where we see barriers to opportunity and access. So another very simple way to think about equity that doesn't involve digging into the data is just to understand, do we have a level playing field? Do we have fair rules in place? Is the system or the systems we have in place, are they just and impartial? Do individuals face additional hurdles because of their race, because of their gender, ethnicity, religious identity? We can spend a lot of time today on definitions, but what I will say just in moving beyond this is that this, by making it clear what we are referring to when we discuss equity, we can also measure and track our progress over time. In particular, we can see if race continues to explain disparities in health outcomes, in education outcomes, in many of the other outcomes that are critical to economic and social mobility in America. So with that definition in mind, our team took on the challenge of measuring how funding for racial equity was changing throughout the pandemic. Now, one central challenge, of course, is that there isn't any one entity that's responsible for keeping track of racial equity funding, and much of this information is gathered in disparate ways and through disparate channels. What we know so far is that in 2020, a record amount of funding was pledged to racial equity. In fact, nearly $12 billion. This is unprecedented. We have never, in our country's history, actually raised this level of funding around racial equity. And I will note that I took on the task of looking back even during the civil rights movement in the 60s, and the dollars pale in comparison to what we saw in 2020. Now, with that, a lot of the dollars are pledged rather than actual commitments. And there is going to be a question about the sustainability and the ability to make good on these pledges, especially by some of the institutional funders. Corporate funders, surprisingly, have been a big part of the response. In fact, in 2020, at least over 70% of the dollars that were pledged came from corporate funders. In contrast, before 2020, less than 6% of grants awarded for racial equity came from corporate funders. But I should mention that we have seen this surge in funding in an environment where there has been systematic underfunding of racial equity or causes led by people of color. In fact, for foundations in particular, 7.4% of total foundation giving was dedicated to people of color, organizations led by people of color over the past 2 decades. And when we look at what happened in 2020, we saw that a lot more funding was going towards policy reform, advocacy work, systems reform. To put this in perspective, generally speaking, just about 4% of overall US focused funding uses this approach. So we did see an inflection point in 2020. The question is, will this continue? Will this be sustained? And I'll also share what individual donors have been during this time. So because our question was really how are individual donors and families responding, I want to share some of the data that we've collected around individual donors. So first, we saw many Americans stepping up to give to COVID-related causes, in particular because COVID was shown to have a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities and also Native American communities. And then we also saw many Americans giving in response to the racial and social justice movement, starting with the killing of George Floyd and many other African Americans. In fact, the GoFundMe campaign for George Floyd's family raised more money than any other campaign for a family that GoFundMe has actually put out. And we saw donations come from more than 140 countries. So that's just one example of how Americans have responded. So the school launched 3 national surveys in 2020. They included surveys of high net worth donors, everyday donors, and working with crowdfunding sites to track giving, including, I mentioned, GoFundMe. We saw the rise of social media fundraising, specifically around racial equity. Individuals were using non-traditional sources to raise funds. It wasn't just GoFundMe, it was all kinds of platforms, including the Nextdoor app being used to mobilize funding, Facebook, digital media. In fact, fundraisers on Facebook raised more than $5 billion, which if you put that in perspective is almost on par with workplace giving campaigns. So we have seen another inflection point, the rise of crowdfunding, the rise of social media fundraising, and a lot of these new platforms being used to raise funds around racial equity. So let me share on a percentage level, even though there has been growth in the percentage of Americans giving, it's still a small fraction. So there's a lot of work to be done. In 2019, about 12%, maybe 13% of Americans gave specifically for racial equity. It went up to 16%, which is an all-time high in 2020. So this is an underfunded area. I don't want to leave you with the impression that everyone is giving to this, but we also see that many Americans, a majority, have reported in 2020 that they feel very compelled to help those in need. There was not just a crisis in one community, it was a crisis that affected Americans of all different backgrounds. And we saw Americans step up to help their neighbors in need. We did see some racial differences in giving to social justice and racial equity. In particular, African Americans and Asian Americans were significantly more likely to support racial equity as a cause area. And the percentage of Americans who are giving to racial justice via crowdfunding has also grown. And here we see mostly younger Americans participating and individuals from diverse backgrounds. One way to look at this data is that giving to racial justice is a more diverse area of giving. Younger Americans in particular are really compelled and drawn to this cause area, and that this is also an opportunity for many larger organizations to partner and to think about how they can use some of these innovative tools to bring in a new group of donors. Now, that is the data. Now, let me also walk you through what we're seeing in terms of the landscape. What is really compelling is that during this period, we conducted interviews with donors at different income levels, high net worth donors, everyday donors, and we asked them several questions. One of those is a polling question that we're going to ask everyone to respond to right now, which is, how is your giving changing, or how has your giving shifted in 2020? Emily, I don't know if, how that's going to work with the polling question, but is there an opportunity to add that in now?
Yes, Susan is going to pull up the poll in just a second.
Okay, perfect. So let's Susan have an opportunity to pull that up, and then we're going to see how this group of donors compares with some of the other donors that we've seen. So the first question is, what are your main funding priorities as a donor? Do you have an area that you have focused on? Is it education? Is it health? Is it community development? Is it some other area? Maybe it's housing, maybe it's the environment, maybe it's international, or some other cause area that you are passionate about. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to respond in terms of their main funding areas.
We have just over 50% of the people who have responded.
Okay, well, do we want to share those results just to get a sense of what our group of donors looks like?
Great. Mm-hmm. And share us.
Wonderful. Well, in some ways, this lines up very nicely with what we see in the national data. So for many donors, everyday donors, religious congregations tends to be the main recipient or destination of their philanthropy, followed by education and human services. During the pandemic, we've seen that many donors have shifted their funding and they focused more on human service giving, basic needs, those in need. But with this racial equity perspective in mind, we've also seen some donors shift their strategies even within the cause areas that they have developed, whether that's education or housing or healthcare, or even in their own religious communities. So let's take the next polling question, which asks about how you as a donor, if you've made any changes in your giving strategies over the past 12 to 16 months. Okay, Emily, I'm going to let you take the lead in queuing us up here and letting us know when we've gotten all our responses in.
Great. We'll have Susan go ahead and end the poll and then share the results.
Wonderful. Well, this is very similar to the results we've seen where many donors have changed their giving patterns, their priorities, or even just some slight modifications and tweaks in response to the racial justice movement. And for some donors, it may not involve a whole new area of giving, but just looking more closely at their current giving patterns, the nonprofits they support, the strategies that they're employing. And also, as I mentioned, this may go beyond your giving. It could be your volunteering, your advocacy, or even your voice, your social media sharing, and many other ways. So we're going to now go back into the research and bring a more qualitative lens here. And I will try to share the conversations we've been a part of over the last 18 months now, almost a year and a half. And I should note that a lot of the work that I will be sharing with you will be released more formally later on this summer. So you're getting a bit of a sneak peek into the work that we are conducting at the Lilly Family School, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So with that in mind, I will go to the next slide here. One aspect of the response has been we would say more of an aggregate response. Many cities across America launched for the first time racial justice funds, funds dedicated solely to address racial inequalities, racial disparities in their cities. And some cities had these in place or were starting these, but for a lot of cities, these were brand new initiatives. And not surprisingly, you'll note that St. Paul was one of, and Minneapolis were among the top places in terms of dollars committed. But we also saw large commitments in Houston, in Boston, and across the United States. Many of these funds are collaborative in nature. That is really exciting, where corporate funders, foundations, and individual donors have put their resources together, combined their efforts with a goal of essentially changing the trajectory of their own communities. What's also exciting, in addition to the collaboration, is the commitments to not go back to business as usual. Many of these funds are trying to lift up grassroots organizations. They're supporting organizations led by communities of color. They're asking tough questions to their grantees in terms of who's on your board. And they're also tackling issues that have long been neglected. For example, in many communities, criminal justice reform is being funded. Groups that are working on voter rights, for example, are included. Juvenile justice is a cause area. So we're seeing these funds not just innovative in the way that they're developed, but the cause areas that they're supporting. And once again, the bringing together of individual donors, corporations, and foundations. In Denver, I have also been very fortunate to watch what's going on in Denver. And here I'll note some areas that have been pretty interesting from a data perspective. In Denver, in addition to the work being done by the philanthropic sector, the local government has also launched a social equity and innovation fund and a city level unit that's dedicated to social equity and innovation. What is exciting about this is that we're seeing new types of partnerships develop at the local government level between philanthropic actors and corporations and funders of different levels. And this speaks to the sustainability work. Given the challenges embodied in the racial equity work, one single individual, one single entity cannot tackle this on their own. And I think to really achieve the kinds of impact that many funders want to see and donors, collaboration is going to have to be part of the equation. Now, to put this in perspective, I noted that we have seen interest in funding racial equity in the past at a much lower level. If you look at the grants that went to civil rights organizations in the 1960s, they were much, much smaller than what we're seeing today, usually in the tens of thousands. I have poured through all those records. And we saw that a lot of the funding was dedicated to education, training, research, and advocacy. And a lot of the funding went to very small grassroots organizations that had shoestring budgets. The goal of the funding was really to bring mechanisms for organizing and for community voice. There are also some critiques that have been leveled against the funding of the civil rights movement, which I'll just mention here. We don't have time to get into it. But the biggest issue that has been raised is around movement capture, that sometimes funders inadvertently, sometimes this is not intentional, can redirect the efforts of grassroots organizations or move them into areas that they were not interested in before. And the very prominent example was the NAACP in the 20s and 30s, where they moved from their work in anti-lynching to education and access, which is not in its own a bad idea, but just that was dictated more by where the funding was available rather than the organization's own initiative. And so the advice that has been given to donors and funders today is to really work with community organizations, listen and learn from them, and try to essentially not impose the types of restrictions that will lead to movement capture. So avoid movement capture is one of the lessons we've learned from the work in the 60s. So with that in mind, I'd like to share what is working. So we know what may not have worked as well in the past. The first aspect of what we're seeing with donors that I would say all of us can do from this webinar and also going forward is how can we all increase our own awareness, our own level of education in this area. Throughout the past 12 to 16 months, we've seen donors of all income levels take an increased interest in learning. Some donors are learning on their own. They're attending sessions, they're going to different types of, like the one we're hosting today. Others are developing groups, learning groups, peer-to-peer learning groups. One organization in Chicago has Teach-In Tuesdays, where they invite someone to come to their group of family group and share some of the lessons. But the biggest takeaway from 2020 and 2021, which we think is going to persist, is that many donors are developing new strategies around their giving. They're leaning into flexible funding models and more unrestricted giving. Why is that? What donors are learning, especially around racial equity, is that the models of the past that were very top-down, where donors told nonprofits what to do and organizations how to spend the money, also limited the impact those organizations were able to have. So flexibility and unrestricted giving is really a new model, and we're seeing that with donors like Mackenzie Scott, but we're also seeing that with everyday donors who are saying, we trust the leaders, we trust the movement, we're going to give our funds, but also allow those organizations to allocate it according to their own priorities. The second takeaway from the interviews we've been conducting is that many donors are engaging with community. In the past, there was this perhaps distance between individual donors and historically underrepresented communities and networks. But as donors are leaning into community engagement, they're also assessing their own funding priorities and looking for ways to address disparities even within their current funding. One example is a donor who said, we've normalized racial disparities in homelessness. The fact that most of our homeless neighbors, and I know this is an issue in Denver, are from disproportionately Black and Brown communities. How can we address this? So recognizing that a lot of the issues that we may support have racial disparities embedded in them, what are some new approaches that can tackle those? And the line that stayed with me was, we should not accept that there are going to be racial disparities everywhere. We should seek to rebuild, remake our world without this as a chronic issue. So I know that because I was in Denver last summer, so I saw the issues around homelessness. I just wanted to highlight that. Now, one of the other places where we've seen a gap is what we are calling the intention gap. In the summer of 2020, so many donors raised their hand and said, I want to do work in this area. I want to support the racial equity movement. I want to support the social justice movement. But a year later, we're seeing a gap. Those individuals who raised their hand, who leaned in, many of them are exhausted from the pandemic, tired from dealing with so many other stressors at work and throughout our communities, political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, lots of factors. And so the question for all of us is, we all want to get our rest. I would recommend that certainly we all take time to reflect, but also start to think about how we can close the gap between our goals, our objectives, and our actions. And so to do that, it's really, how do we expand our notion of philanthropy? In the past, most donors thought about giving as where to start. And this is where we have now at the Lilly Family School pushed the idea of the 4 T's. The idea that it's not just about the checkbook and the money, but it's also about how you use your voice and your influence and how you use and allocate your time. So in terms of all of the assets that all of us have, I just want to highlight something that all of us can do. The first is, how do we look at our giving portfolio to ensure that we are inclusive in our own giving? Are there donors, organizations that serve primarily people of color? Do we have organizations that are led by people of color? What about the board members? So as you use your giving to create the kind of change you'd like to see in the world. The second is testimony. What are your unique assets, the places, the seats that you occupy? How can you use your voice to drive change? And then finally, how can you use your time? Can you volunteer to support local and national organizations that are working on the front lines of racial equity? One example that I thought about during the pandemic and the racial justice movement was Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And he said something that really stayed with me. He said basically that the most important thing he can do for an organization is not write a check, but it's actually open up his network to that organization, introduce them to his friends, bring talent to the organization. So in addition to giving to communities of color and organizations led by people of color, what else can you do within your own purview to advance racial equity? So I know we have one more polling question, and Emily, I don't know if you want to cue that up.
Yes, Susan will go ahead and launch it for us.
Okay. So in this closing the intention gap, I think for many individuals, it really has to be aligned with your own priorities as a donor. So what areas of giving would you like to learn more about? Would you like to invest more in, use more of your time, your resources, your testimony? And here, there are many areas. The exciting part about this work is that it spans education, healthcare, but can also be specifically in the areas of advocacy and policy reform, movement building, and may not even involve necessarily changing the areas that you're supporting. So let's pause and see what areas of giving individuals are most interested in and what the polling results show. Excellent. So as you can see, this is really interesting. A lot of people have cited advocacy and policy reform, and that's actually where the testimony piece comes in. What we've seen with many organizations that we've worked with throughout this 12 to 16 month or 12 to 18 month period is that organizations like the National Urban League, the NAACP, many of them say, it's wonderful that donors want to write checks, and we certainly support that, but we also want them to use their other assets, their voice, their time, all of the resources that they have available to advance this work. And so it's great to see that is already present in this group of donors. So as we start to wrap up the formal part of the presentation, we have spent the last 12 to 16 months being inundated with opportunities to learn. I think a lot of people have taken that step of learning about racial equity, learning about how philanthropy itself can be a partner in this work. And so I just want to make it very simple for everyone to think about how they can join this racial equity movement and how they can bring a racial equity lens to their giving. The first one is removing barriers. In all of the work that you do, really think about what can you do to make sure that there isn't in the organizations you are part of, in the ones you give to, what are they doing to dismantle these barriers? The second one is one that I have taken very seriously. How can we build collaborative efforts, understanding that one donor alone cannot solve this problem, but working together. So as a donor, can you reach out to organizations, networks? Can you collaborate with existing initiatives in your own city? The third and probably the most exciting innovation that I've seen, and all of us are trying to do this in our work, how are we reaching out to grassroots organizations and diverse networks? For example, the Racial Equity Fund here in Indianapolis, as it was being convened, one of the funders mentioned to me, I'd like to have a steering committee. Can you nominate individuals? But I don't want anyone who is over 35. I want young grassroots leaders to be part of this initiative. I also want leaders from communities of color to be on the steering committees, to be part of dispersing the funds. So we can be intentional in really seeking out that new group of leaders, diverse group of leaders. And then finally, all of us, whether you have 1 follower or 1 million followers, we can share stories. Testimony is really a powerful tool in this environment. Whether those are publicly shared on social media or even privately shared with family members, with your mentees, what can you do to advance racial equity? And finally, we focused a lot on the philanthropic side, specifically donors and philanthropic support. But in all of our work, I think, whether it's in the workplace, in your personal day-to-day efforts, what can you do to be an agent for racial equity? So finally, a call to action. We've shared the research. We've shared a lot of what's been taking place around the country. I think there's a lot to say, but in summary, one of the things I will just share is what I have been doing as a donor in the last year and a half. The first one is to really lift up equity and inclusion concerns in every seat that I occupy, to ask who's not sitting at this table, who needs to be present. If it's a grant-making body, or if it's a donor body, if it's a group of nonprofits, how do we make sure that communities are represented and that community voice is centered? The second is that where is this leadership going to come from? Many of you on the webinar today are on boards. You are leaders in your own right, in your families, in your workplaces, in your communities. Leaders are being asked to do much more in today's environment. The third point is one that is really vital. There is a need for all of us to look at all the areas of our giving, the time, donations, the talent, the treasure, the testimony that we provide with an equity lens. In other words, bringing, dismantling barriers and bringing access to opportunity in all of those different areas. And finally, and probably importantly, to innovate in this environment, collaboration is going to be part of the equation. This includes, for many organizations, working with giving circles, grassroots organizations, affinity-based giving organizations. Denver in particular has some really, I'd say, very exciting models. There's the Black Men's Giving Circle in Denver. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with them. There are also giving circles of all different types. And donors can work with these organizations to identify grassroots organizations, grassroots leaders. Here in Indianapolis, for example, many donors have said, oh, I'd like to learn more about grassroots organizations, but I don't know where to find them. And so fortunately, we have a community ambassadors program at our community foundation, which allows donors to connect and plug into those grassroots efforts in real time so they can learn and also act in real time. So with that, I'd like to just say thank you once again. That's the formal end of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it right back over to Emily.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Osili. That was a very interesting and informative presentation. I would love to open up the floor to the participants here today to see if anyone has any questions. We are a small and familiar group, so I invite you to take yourself off mute, or if you prefer, you can put your question into the chat. But just to get us started, one of the questions that I had from your presentation was, you talked about the importance of reaching and supporting grassroots organizations. As an individual donor, what are the markers or indicators that I can find and see that an organization really is taking into account authentic avenues for community voice?
Yes, that's a great question, Emily. And one of the challenges is that there isn't any roster of grassroots organizations that you can turn to. But fortunately, with the advent of technology and social media, we've seen a lot of neighborhood groups in particular emerge during the pandemic, mutual aid organizations that are actually delivering groceries, helping seniors get to the hospital, organizing communities for voting, and even neighborhood cleanup organizations. And we've also seen larger nonprofits reach out to those grassroots. And I'll give you the Indianapolis example. We've started to keep track of those groups that are actually achieving results on the ground so that we can partner with them. And I would say that is the model that we are really emphasizing, is identifying those leaders that are driving change and helping support them, because the reality is that many of those individuals and leaders are working on the front lines of racial equity with very little funding, very little support, and just even the support and encouragement, whether it's through funding, volunteer efforts, advocacy, can be a game changer.
Great. Thank you. Do we have any brave souls who want to come off mute?
I'll be glad to.
Yes.
We have two brave. Well, I'll call on Kate first and then Scott.
That was really excellent. Thank you so much. I was really surprised to see the amount of giving from corporations. And I wonder if you, well, two things. One, are those dollars getting to grassroots organizations, first of all? And two, do you think this is a trend, or do you think that, after so many things are no longer in the spotlight, individual donors will really be the ones giving to these issues?
Very good point. Now, one of the reasons that corporations have been so visible is that they've raised their hands, they've been very public, and they've committed to racial equity. Now, whether those pledges, some of them are 5-year commitments, 10-year commitments, it's going to take a lot to make sure that corporations actually deliver on those. We've also seen, I don't want to lose this thread as well, a lot of individuals really step up, and they may not have said racial equity per se. One example is McKinsey Scott, where she has given to several HBCUs $40 million to Howard University. That's the largest gift Howard has ever received in its entire history. The founder of Netflix also gave to several HBCUs. And then just this week, Jeff Bezos made 2 very large unrestricted gifts to people of color, Van Jones and the founder of World Central Kitchen, Jose Andreas, to disperse in the ways that they see fit, unrestricted, flexible support. McKinsey Scott was also exemplary in that she gave the money to Howard with no strings attached. In other words, Howard is empowered to allocate those funds in the areas that are most needed.
My question was actually very much similar to that, which was just how to sustain this interest in major corporate and even major individuals, like you've pointed out, their interest in giving to this area. In some ways, it feels that we've captured a moment in time when the country became focused on some of these issues. And certainly for some corporations, it's not only the goodness of their hearts through which they're acting, but it's also what they think is the best way to, I guess, to ensure that their brand is accepted by the American people. And I just don't know if you, in your study, have seen this type of action before, or if this is, where in the past it might have happened and gone away, or if this might be something that sustains.
We hope that it is sustained, but I think for corporations to continue this commitment, there's going to have to be pressure on those companies. And that's going to come from all of us, consumers, as well as shareholders and internal stakeholders. 2 other movements are similar. The LGBTQ movement did get a lot of corporate support and has continued to do so. And gender equity is another area where corporations have also really stayed committed. But a lot of that is because of the accountability that's built in and the transparency that has been required of corporations. And the last area is on the environmental sustainability, which you could say is another area that corporations are stepping up in this era of woke capitalism, I think it's called. But I think to make progress, there'll need to be the same sort of sustained tracking accountability and transparency. And to date, while that is present in the environmental movement and to some extent around gender equity, there hasn't been that same commitment in terms of transparency from the part of the corporations to say, this is how much we've pledged, this is how much we've committed, these are the organizations that have received the funding. In contrast, we've seen McKinsey Scott, I'll give her as an example, she's been super transparent about how she's giving, who she's giving to. And when we have followed up with those organizations, they've received the money. It wasn't just pledged, it was paid in 2020. And that is also true with Jeff Bezos and also the founder of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, where he has a spreadsheet where you can actually see. So I guess this is a push for those of you who are working in corporations to encourage the companies that you have influence over to share those commitments, share where the funds are being dispersed, and if the organizations have actually received them, because it's one thing to pledge, but then paid is another. And I think that's where we're seeing some gap in terms of intentions and action.
So I have a question. Thank you for your presentation and research-based and very well done. Thank you. I'm an old-time fundraiser, turned philanthropic advisor, turned donor. And one of my questions has to do with gift agreements and legal restrictions. And the reason for asking that question is I remember back in the day when we had a minority engineering program for scholarships for the students, and iteratively we had to change language in gift agreements and understandings at a university between a university and the donor. And it became broader and broader and broader, and other programs had to be developed because you couldn't restrict the donations for specific groups for scholarships and such. So the bigger question is, what are the legal restrictions? How do you deal with them so that the understanding of the organization and the understanding of the donor is the alignment of values and intent? I'll stop there.
That's a great question. And it's one that we have actually seen many universities tackle. In this environment, I think there has been more support than there has been in the past for designating gifts for specific causes. I think the pendulum had swung away from that, but we're starting to see, for example, scholarships that are being designated for Black students or LGBTQ or Latinx students and so forth. The other side of this is I think there's an opportunity for institutions to educate donors and maybe work with policymakers. I mean, this is also to understand how they can, I'd say, design the gift agreement so that the donor intent is recognized and valued and aligned without coming into resistance from legal statutes that might emphasize more of a broadening. So the simple answer is that the current environment does allow organizations to have more restrictions in place, but at the same time, I don't know that it will stay that way. So I think this is, I don't know what the future holds. One of our deans here at the education school, they launched a scholarship just in 2020 after the George Floyd, specifically for students of color at the education school. And they said this was just an opportunity. So many new donors came into the organization, but they did get some backlash where there were donors who said, we don't want to, we're going to stop giving to the School of Education because you have this big fund around racial equity. But what he came away with was the overwhelming preponderance of individuals were giving to lift up this cause, and it was just a small group of individual detractors.
So the follow-up to that is, what can be done to clarify the legal environment so that it isn't a pendulum where you go, yes, you can do it, no, you can't, yes, you can do it, no, you can't, depending on which administration is in power or what legal advice you go. It will be different in different states. I mean, I think you're fraught in trying to do something with creating, say, an endowment, a large endowment, and with that's restricted, and all of a sudden it can't be used for the purpose intended. So I'm going to stop there, but I think that there's an issue that can be worked on at the higher levels of of policy, which would include the Lilly School, because
Absolutely.
I think that's something that has to be done on a national level.
Absolutely, and I agree. That's a great question. Great suggestion too.
Dr. Osili, I had another question come in through the chat. If I have an interest in a particular area, the arts, for example, or education, how might I bring an equity lens to thinking about the organizations that I support with my giving?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And what I would recommend there is that there are a number of toolkits that are available online. I think the Rose Community Foundation might even have one that are questions that you can pose to the grantees. So I don't even think you have to suddenly get a whole new portfolio of grantees, but you could even start with the ones you are funding and ask them, what are they doing around these issues? And as an example, some of the funders we talked with said, they love the organizations they currently fund, but they didn't know very much about anything those organizations were doing around racial equity. So they asked the questions, if it's an arts group, what are you doing to engage communities of color? Do you have staff, board members that are diverse board members? What about your programming? The arts can be such an important accelerator of racial equity in our communities because not only do they entertain, but they can inform and heal. And so really what I have seen is that arts organizations, many of them are working to address these gaps that they have, whether it's on the programming side, on the staffing side, on the community engagement side. Another track, in addition to this toolkit, is looking at, are there some new organizations that you'd like to support? And beyond your giving, what about the other assets you have, your time, your talents, your testimony? Can you lift up arts groups in Denver that are primarily led by people of color, artists? One very small example, my husband and I, during the past year, decided we're going to find some Black artists that we were going to support and fund them to design some work in our own home. So artists have been really hard hit in the pandemic, whether they're dancers or painters or other types of artists. So even supporting individual artists can be a game changer. The good news here is that there's so many options for working on racial equity in philanthropy, and there are many tools that all will have a big impact collectively. So I applaud the person who raised that question. And I think from what I can see in Denver, it's a wonderful arts community. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask of Dr. Osili?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. Dr. Osili, this was such a helpful presentation, and I just want to thank you for all the data-driven information, especially. I'm interested in your point about restricted versus unrestricted giving. And as somebody who does work for the LGBTQ movement in a philanthropy, we tend to focus a lot of our work in project grants and in very specific, to use your language, restricted giving. That is in our game to increase accountability between the philanthropies and the grantees themselves. But can you talk about maybe the value of changing that model toward unrestricted? To us, it does feel a little bit like turning a blind eye toward our grantees and kind of setting them free because the movement is so large and so disparate. But what else is the value of giving a grantee money and saying, do your best with it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I love this question because it's at the very heart of all of everything that we're talking about now. So during the pandemic, what a lot of funders and donors learned was that they might have given funding for, let's just say, the arts, for this big performance. The performance can't take place because of social distancing, or it has to be moved to virtual. So all of the funding that was allocated could not be used for its intended purpose. So this meant revising the grants in a very difficult environment because you have to resubmit it, has to be. So a lot of funders were thinking, wait a minute, why don't we ask the organizations what they need the funding for and then allocate the funds that way? And so it led to a bit of a conversation, and that's where this trust-based philanthropy comes in, where donors can say, you know, I really want to have a conversation first and understand what your priorities are. Let's design the grant or the gift, the donation, with your objectives and goals, your vision in mind. So the unrestricted model gives more flexibility to the grantee, gives more voice to the grantee, and sets up, I think, or takes away this power imbalance that we often struggle with, where the grantee is sort of at the beck and call of the funder rather than really a collaborative model. Having said that, I think there are some good reasons to have restrictions in place to say, you know, we want the grant to go to this particular purpose. But what I am really emphasizing, and in my work, both as a donor and a trustee and board member, is also thinking about how you can do both. So you may say, let's give you at least 20% of this grant that's going to be unrestricted. And as emergencies come up, and we are in a fluid crisis environment, I think, although we're starting to see vaccines and COVID numbers go down, we're not out of the woods. So we want to give grantees that flexibility, that ability to innovate, to be creative, to be nimble. And if they're tied to it has to be done this way in this time frame, they lose that degree of freedom. So I certainly understand funders that aren't ready to go all into unrestricted giving, but are willing to take some steps in that direction. So even if it's, let's put 10 to 20% of this grant that's going to be an innovation fund. We know that you are still in a crisis. Arts organizations, some of them are developing new models of reaching audiences. Let's give you that space, that flexibility, that creativity. And then it sets up a different type of dynamic with the grantee. And I can tell you that funders and families that have approached it that way have been very excited about the results, because what they're learning is that the grantees, the donor, and the individuals that are working in the nonprofit can have a different type of relationship that's based on trust and community voice. Now, again, I'm saying this in an environment where so much is changing, and that may be when we come out of this crisis, perhaps we go back to the restricted and less flexible model. But in an environment where we need creativity, we're encouraging organizations to innovate and to be resilient. It seems like giving them some tools to address let's call it cascading nature of the crisis. Maybe the funds were for homelessness, but now there's a city grant for homelessness, so they can use those funds to address food insecurity. You know, so that type of flexibility in real time makes a big difference. There's so many examples around the country, but the Howard example with Mackenzie Scott, we had the president of Howard as one of our speakers, and he spoke to how powerful it was that was unrestricted, because they could take those funds and look at where the needs were, where the gaps were, and how they could respond once again to the evolving dynamic nature of the crisis. But excellent, a very thoughtful question.
Thank you for that. That was an excellent answer. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate in all of your ideas and ways to start getting involved in this equity-based philanthropy. You're really suggesting just start with a portion of your giving, and you don't need to jump in head first. Give it a go, see how it feels with a certain allocation of your work, and see where it goes from there. Does anyone have any other questions? We have time. There have been so many great ones so far. Well, if not, I will turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Indick, our Vice President of Philanthropic Services, to close out today's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Osili, for everything today. This has been incredibly informative and interesting, and thank you for your time. I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much, Dr. Osili, for this interesting and engaging session. Thank you to all the folks at the Rose Community Foundation team and at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy team who helped work to make today possible. And of course, big thank you to all of you for joining us and for your great questions being part of the conversation today. We always hope that a good learning opportunity is also a call to action. And so in addition to Dr. Osili's great tips and strategies to take forward, we want to share with you a couple of resources that we have for you related to this work. First, in May, Rose Community Foundation released a racial justice and equity giving guide profiling 20 local grassroots organizations working to advance racial justice in our community, many of which may not be on your radar, but all of which are led by really visionary nonprofit leaders. We'll share a link to the guide in case you haven't seen it yet in our follow-up email that you'll receive after the webinar. Second, we are in the early stages of launching a new kind of giving collaborative in partnership with Righteous Rage Institute for Social Justice, one of the grantees featured in the giving guide. It's called the Conductor Circle. It will bring together institutional and individual donors along with Black community members and community leaders to work together to really center community in philanthropic decision-making, and conversely to decenter wealth and traditional sources of power. Starting in early fall, this group will meet together for 6 sessions over 6 months to learn and to build relationships and connections, and ultimately to make grants supporting Denver's Black community. If this opportunity sounds interesting to you, I hope you will reach out to me to learn more. And finally, and maybe most importantly, as you take your next steps in this work and think about follow-up conversations you want to have with colleagues, with your family, how you might put into practice some of these ideas in your next steps in your giving, our team is here to be a sounding board and a resource and support to you in your next steps. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and take care.